It is great to see everyone on this fine Sunday morning. We know that as people who are striving to follow God, people who are trying to be faithful to God, that we need to spend dedicated time striving to be individually better Christians. We also know that we need to spend dedicated time becoming better members of the congregation, serving the congregation and taking time to take care for our fellows' needs. We also know that we need to spend dedicated time trying to be a better spouse, bettering our relationship with our spouse. And we know that we need to spend dedicated time becoming better parents. If we've got kids or if we've got grandkids, we need to become better parents. But that's a lot of things. When you start adding up all the time it would take to dedicate time to each of these different aspects of our Christian lives, it starts to get overwhelming. And we start to think, man, I've got a job, I've got school, I've got, got to sleep at some point. And, downtime for my own mental well-being is also important. So how can I do this? How can I spend dedicated time becoming a better Christian and a better member of the church and a better spouse and a better parent? How can I do that? Well, here's the cool part about it. God knows that we don't have an infinite number of hours in the day. And God knows that we don't have an infinite amount of attention in the day. And so God designed it such that as we grow in each of these different areas, it impacts the others. As we become a better Christian, well, you become a better member of the church because you see the importance of the body and you see how you need to serve the body. And as you become a better Christian, you become a better spouse because you start to grow in and internalize the ideas of self-sacrifice and love and gentleness and kindness. And the same with being a better parent. As you become a better Christian, you see how you as a Christian should treat your kids. And then it continues. As you become a better member of the church, well, you're spending time with God's people who are encouraging you and helping you see your weaknesses and your strengths. And so you're growing to be a better Christian. And as you become a better member of the church, you and your spouse are working together. And so you become a better spouse. And as you become a better member of the church, you become a better parent because you have these people who are encouraging you and helping you to be a better parent. And the trend continues. As you become a better spouse, you start to see those connections between Christ and His church and the relationship between spouses, and that makes you a better Christian. And you are working together with your spouse to serve the church, and that builds up your relationship with the church. And as the marital relationship grows stronger, you both become better parents. And then as you grow becoming a better parent, you see the connections between how God treats His children and how we are supposed to treat our children, and that makes you a better Christian and a better spouse, and a better member of the church. Each of these areas impacts the others. So while we're growing in one of these areas, if we're paying attention, we're growing in the others. Let's use the analogy of our physical bodies. When you exercise, I'm not aware of any exercises that work only one muscle. There's some very specific ones that work only one muscle group. But whenever we are moving, we're moving multiple muscles. Think about when you're walking or running or jogging, whatever you like to do. Sure, your legs are getting work, but so is your core muscles and your cardiovascular system, your lungs and your heart. And as you move your arms are getting worked. And if you've ever done long running, you realize that your neck is getting work as well. Your whole body is getting impacted. Same with something like push-ups or sit-ups. Sure, there's a target muscle group, but everything else gets worked in conjunction with it. And so when we look at our Christian lives, none of these aspects of our Christian life is fully separated from everything else. They're all interconnected. That also means that when we are neglecting a particular area, we are neglecting the whole. Now, you may be asking yourself, okay, David, I thought we were in a sermon series about God's wisdom for the family. What does my spiritual growth and the interconnectedness of my spiritual growth have to do with God's wisdom for the family? Well, today's sermon in particular is the importance of godly parents and grandparents. And as I was studying out the various passages that talk about parenting and grandparenting, well, there's honestly not that many passages that directly state why parents and grandparents are so important. There's a whole bunch that say, teach your kids the discipline of the Lord. But the rest of the minutia of being a parent is wrapped in with, be a good Christian. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about blessing our children and grandchildren with the various aspects of our Christian lives. We're first going to talk about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving God. We're then going to talk about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving the church. We're then going to talk about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving our spouse. And fourthly, we're going to talk about loving or blessing our children and grandchildren with our time. Now, two caveats on this. First, I'm wrapping parents and grandparents together because as I was studying this out, the things I would say to grandparents are basically the same things I would say to parents, just one generation removed. So if you're grandparents, everything we're talking about here applies just with the next generation down. Second caveat, if you don't have kids or grandkids, there's things in these lessons for you too. One, you may eventually be kids. Two, you interact with children. You may have nieces and nephews. You also interact with kids here at the congregation, like my kids and the Malcolm's kids. And you have an impact on those kids, even if they're not your kids. So the things we're talking about here absolutely apply to every demographic in the church. So with these things in mind, let's jump in and let's talk about blessing your children and your grandchildren by loving God. And this goes back to that very central tenet that we've discussed a little bit over the last few weeks already, and that is Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Silas read this morning. We sung a song about it just now. And we read, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." This statement is at the center of absolutely everything we do. Why do we do anything? Well, it's because we love God. This it should be. And we're supposed to love Him with all that we are, all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our might. In fact, Jesus says that this is the greatest commandment in Matthew 22, 36 through 39. And the second is like unto it, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. He goes on, and we read, "These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart." Why? Why should these words be on your heart? Well, because you love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. He says, "You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." Here's the thing about this. We're familiar with this, right? Teach your kids. Okay. Well, the thing about it is that you must love God before you can teach your children to love God. You can't teach them to do this unless you demonstrate it. Sure, you may be able to teach facts and figures about the Bible. Sure, you may be able to tell them, hey, you need to love God. But if you don't love God, you can't actually pass that love for Him on to them, because our example makes a larger impact than our words. They see our actions. They see our attitude. And if we say, you need to love God and be a faithful Christian, and we don't demonstrate that in our lives, our words are meaningless. It's like that old story that we've all probably heard a version of, where there's an old man sitting and smoking a cigarette, and his grandson comes and sits beside him and is smoking a cigarette. And the granddad says, hey, you shouldn't be smoking. Smoking's bad for you. It's going to ruin your health. And the grandson says, but you've been smoking my entire life. And the grandfather says, do as I say, not as I do. Well, do those words mean anything? No, they don't. The kid's going to see the example, and he's going to follow the example, not the words. And that is true with us as well. We could tell our kids, you need to be a faithful Christian all day long. But if we don't demonstrate that with our lives, our words are meaningless. The passage goes on and says, you shall bind them as you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So they should be, I just noticed my microphone's not on. There we go, sorry. They should be part of everything we do and everything we are. Now this is exemplified in 2 Timothy 1, 3 through 7. We see an example of this. Let's go up there. 2 Timothy 1, 3 through 7. And we notice, starting in verse 3, Paul says to Timothy, I thank God whom I serve with a clear conscience the way my forefathers did, as I constantly remember you in my prayers night and day, longing to see you even as I recall your tears, so that I may be filled with joy. He goes on and he says, for I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure that it is in you as well. You notice that. Paul recognizes Timothy's sincere faith, that genuine faith. But that genuine faith first dwelt in his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. And I love the way that he words this. That faith first dwelt. It's not a different faith. You notice that. See, Timothy's mother and grandmother had to mature in the faith in order to pass it on to him. They needed to have that to pass it on. It's the same faith that they had that they passed on to Timothy. Now you notice I use a particular phrase here, and this was my wife's addition, and I think it's very apt. That they were maturing in the faith. It's not that they had faith at one time and then lost it at some point. They had that faith and they were growing in that faith. Similarly, we must mature in the faith in order to pass it on to our children and grandchildren. We must have a faith that is active and growing in order to demonstrate that to them. I've known people who, because they felt they had to, they brought their kid to church on at least a monthly basis. And then they wonder, why did my kid not continue in the faith? Well, if you didn't demonstrate it to them, they're not going to continue in it. We have to demonstrate that genuine, maturing faith to our children by acting on it in our lives. Because our example makes a larger impact than our words. They will see our example and they will follow that example. Now, of course, this isn't necessarily always true. We all know of situations where the parents did their best to teach a honest, genuine faith to a child, and the child still fell away because we all have our own self-will, and we sometimes make bad decisions. But this concept, the overriding idea, is seen there. And we also see it when we discuss the elders. Let's go to Titus 1, 5 through 6. And again, we discussed this some in previous weeks. And we read, for this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. And then it goes on and it gives the rest of those qualifications for an elder. We notice in this that the having children who believe is wrapped in with everything else. It's not some separate item in the elder's life. See, the elder's commitment to God is part of why his children are faithful to God. His example had an impact on them. And this is clear evidence that our example makes a larger impact than our words. The example of the parents makes a larger impact on the children than their words do. So, we see that we can bless our children and grandchildren by loving God. Now let's take it to the next step. And let's talk about blessing your children and grandchildren by loving the church. Now, I really wish that the connection between loving God and loving the church was so obvious that everybody got it and we didn't have to talk about it. But sadly, it's not. There's this disconnect that some people have where they say, well, I can love God, but I don't need His church. I don't need that group of people. I can do my own thing and still love God. Well, the scriptures don't really hold that concept up. Let's look at a passage that shows the importance of this. Let's go to 1 Peter 1, 17 through 23. 1 Peter 1, 17 through 23. And we read, starting verse 17, if you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves in fear during the time of your stay on earth, knowing that you are not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. So we start out this section and we see that we need to be careful how we live our lives. We need to conduct ourselves with fear because our God is an amazing God. We've been redeemed with this amazing gift, not with perishable things, but with the blood of Christ. It goes on and says, for he who was foreknown before the foundations of the world, but has appeared in these last times for your sake, who through him are believers in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. So our faith and hope is in God. Our faith and hope goes back to that one who created the universe. Remember, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Then it says in verse 22, since you have in obedience to the truth purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart. You notice how our salvation and how awesome our God is directly tied to the way we treat His people. Now, I'm not saying that our salvation rests on it, but I'm saying that we love His people because God redeemed us. We love His people because our God is awesome. Since you have, in obedience to truth, purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren. How did you do that? Well, you were saved by the blood of Christ. That blood of Christ purified us so that we could love the brethren with a pure love. Then he says this command, fervently love one another from the heart. He doesn't say casually love one another from the heart. He doesn't say, if you feel like it, love one another from the heart. He says, fervently love one another from the heart, for you have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable. That is through the living and enduring word of God. So we should love the brethren, not because they've done neat stuff for us, not because they are all that in a bag of chips, but we should love the brethren because we've been born again by this imperishable seed. That is the living and enduring word of God. So that love of the brethren should flow directly from the fact that we are thankful to God. See, we should fervently love the Lord's church. Of course, the church is made up of the people, right? We love the brethren. Now, the thing about this is that our children will absorb the attitude we display about the church. They will absorb our attitude. You ever known someone or been in a situation where, like I said, yourself or somebody else is bad-mouthing the church? And, if we're honest, most of us have probably done it at some point. Something negative happens and we're maybe we're not calling people, but maybe we're at home, we're complaining and talking about the problems at the church. There's this problem and there's that problem, and this person has this problem and that person has that problem, and they always do this and they never do that, and it's all bad. Well, what happens if that's the only way you ever talk about the church? Well, if you display a negative attitude about the church, why would your children want to continue in it? If all they hear about the church as they're growing up is how bad it is and how awful the people are, why would they continue in it? Sadly, I've known preachers who this is the way that they talked about the church. And then they're utterly shocked when their kids get out of the house and they leave the church. And I've had the opportunity to talk to some of those kids whose dad was a preacher and who have left the church. And part of the big spaghetti mess of why they left the church is quite often because they only heard negativity about it from their parents. That has a big impact. But of course, the flip side of this is true also. If when you're talking about the church, you have a good attitude and you're talking about how awesome they are and what a blessing they are and how, yeah, they've got problems, but they're growing and they're addressing those problems and they're such a blessing and they do this that's awesome and they do that that's great and they do this and it's always positive. Well, if you display a positive attitude about the church, your children have more reason to want to continue in it. And that right there gives them huge incentive. Yeah, sure, people have problems, absolutely. But they're growing, and they're trying to bless each other. Those kids are going to grow up, and they're going to think, yeah, the church is made up of people who make mistakes. But the church is a blessing. See, our example makes a larger impact than our words. And so if we display that we love the Lord's church, our children are more likely to grow up to love the Lord's church. Now we're going to take a shift. We're going to take a shift from looking at God and His church to talking about blessing your children and grandchildren by loving your spouse. This goes back to some of the best advice I've ever been given. Years ago, before we even had kids, I was given the advice that the best gift you can give your children is to love their mother. And I don't even have kids. What are you talking about? Well, it's true. Eventually we did have kids, obviously. And it's true. And then I've heard this advice throughout the years, and it always stands up. That the best gift a father can give his children is to love their mother. Let's talk about this a little bit. Let's go to Proverbs 18:22. Proverbs 18:22 says, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord." Now, I had a gentleman one time ask me, well, what if the wife I found isn't a good thing? Okay, so this isn't so much talking about the quality of the wife as it's talking about your attitude about the wife. He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. See, husbands, the way you view your wife impacts the way you treat your wife. If you view your wife as a blessing from God who is a good thing in your life, you're going to treat her like a blessing from God who is a good thing in your life. But if you view her as a detriment, as a problem, as a difficulty, you're going to treat her as a detriment, a problem, and something that you don't want to be around. Your attitude impacts the way you treat your wife. And here's the thing about it. The way you treat your wife is how your sons will learn to treat the women in their lives. A son learns how to treat women by how his father treats his mother. And the way that you as a father treat your wife is how your son is going to treat your wife and his sisters and the women in his life in the future. That's statistically the way it works out. And the way you treat your wife trains your daughters what to look for in a man. Statistically speaking, children tend to marry people who are like their parents, and it plays out quite often. I am somewhat like my father-in-law, and my wife is very much like my mother. Your daughters will look for a man who treats her like you treat your wife. Our example makes a larger impact than our words do. We can tell our kids all day long, this is what you should look for in a spouse. But they're going to follow our example. And, of course, this goes for the mother as well. Let's go to Proverbs 14. Proverbs 14, verse 1, reads, "The wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her own hands." So that wise woman, she builds her house. And we're not talking about, the bricks on the outside. We're not saying she's a mason. She builds her household, her husband, her children. She builds them up, makes them stronger. But the foolish tears it down with her own hands. So wives, the way you view your husband impacts the way you treat your husband. You ever seen a gaggle of women to get together and they complain about their husbands? Oh, he's never doing this right. He's always doing that wrong, and complain and complain and complain. Well, the way that you view your husband impacts the way you treat him. If you view him as a problem, you're going to treat him as a problem. But of course, if you view him as a blessing, as someone who is a huge boon or a big helper, then you're going to treat him in that way. If you view him with respect, you'll treat him with respect. And then we get down to the brass tacks. The way you treat your husband is how your daughters will learn to treat the men in their lives. You know, when you see a little girl who's bratty and rude, where'd she learn that? Quite possibly from her mom. And the way that you treat your husband trains your sons what to look for in a woman. See, your example makes a larger impact than your words. This goes back to yet another old tenant. I was, again, given some advice, and it goes for both genders, both directions. But the question was asked of me, if your daughter dated someone exactly like you, would you be happy or worried? That's a really good question, right? Because chances are they will. And for the women, if your son dated someone exactly like you, would you be happy or worried? Because the way that you act is what they're going to look for. But this doesn't just go along with our example to our kids. Loving our spouse also impacts the parenting of our spouse. Let's go to Ephesians 5. We studied this a few times over the last few weeks, but it's worth looking at again. But today we're going to look at it from a slightly different angle than we looked at it previously. So last week we discussed chapter 5, verses 22 through 24, and verse 33, talked about how the wife cares for her husband's emotional needs. And we read, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives ought to be subject to their own husbands in everything." And then verse 33, "Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." So God built men to have this need for respect, to be respected. And when the wife gives him that respect, it fulfills a need he has. And then we see in the next section, verses 25 through 33, that the husband cares for his wife's spiritual, emotional, and physical needs. And we read, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless." So we see this example of Christ, that he gave himself up for the church, and the husband is to love his wife in the same way Christ loved the church. Goes on and says, "So husbands ought also love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does with the church, because we are members of his body." So not only is he to love his wife as Christ loved the church, but he's supposed to love his wife as he loves himself, as he takes care of his own body. It says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, each individual among you also is to love his own wife, even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband." So we see this mutual care going back and forth, that each of them is taking care of each other's needs. Now, the point I want us to make from this about blessing our children is that when you are taking care of your spouse's needs, then they have the bandwidth to be the best parents they can be. We've probably observed it in people, where when there's strife in the marriage, The husband and wife are going at it. They're arguing. They're fighting. They're having problems. And because all of their attention, all of their energy is spent in that strife with each other, the children get neglected or even abused. Because the parents don't have the attention, don't have the energy, don't have the mental capacity to be good parents. But when the spouses are taking care of each other's needs, the husband is taking care of the wife's needs, and the wife is taking care of the husband's needs, they have the bandwidth to be good parents. Now, when I say bandwidth, I mean mental energy, the attention. I'm using an analogy from, of course, Wi-Fi. When you have too many devices using the Wi-Fi, it eats up the ability for that Wi-Fi to work. And the same is true with the activity in your mind. When your mind is taken up with strife and conflict, you don't have the attention, you don't have the mental capacity to be the best parent you can be. But when your needs are taken care of, when both spouses are caring for each other, then they have the mental capacity, the attention to be the absolute best parents that they can be. So by loving your spouse, you are setting an example for your kids, and you are providing the optimal environment for them to grow in a healthy manner. So we've talked about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving God. We've talked about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving the church. And we've talked about blessing our children and grandchildren by loving our spouse. Now let's talk about blessing your children and grandchildren with your time. And this is the aspect that's probably the most obvious, right? Any of us can say, yes, I need to spend time with my children and grandchildren. Let's look at a passage that drives us home. Let's go back to Deuteronomy. We're covering this passage a lot, and that's good. Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, again states, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." So we look at that. Okay. First off, what does it not say? It doesn't say, you shall delegate the teaching to the Bible class teachers on Sunday morning. He doesn't say, you shall delegate the teaching of these laws to the school system. He says, you shall diligently teach these things to your children. Okay, exclusively at bedtime Bible hour? No. When you sit in your house, so you're having meals, you're spending time in the house, teach them about God. And when you walk by the way, so you're going to the market, you're going about your daily business with the kids, teach them about God. When you lie down and when you rise up. So as you're putting them to bed, you teach them about God. When they're getting up in the morning, you teach them about God. This implies a lot of time spent with the children. Now, of course, the society back then was significantly different than our society now. They didn't have public schools that you pawned your kids off onto for most of the day. The parents would take the kids to the field, and the boys would be out working in the field with dad while the girls were inside learning about housekeeping from mom. But the fact of the matter is, we need to spend time with our children and grandchildren. We must be willing to invest our time to train our children and grandchildren. You notice the word invest. Because when you use that time, it is not time wasted. It's an investment in the future. Specifically an investment in their future. Because as you teach them God's word, as you teach them to love God, as you spend your time teaching them, their future is greatly impacted. You may not see the result right now, but you see it when they get older. And that passage finishes up by saying, you shall bind them as signs on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So, today, as we've been talking about the importance of godly parents and grandparents, we've discussed blessing your children and grandchildren by loving God. We've discussed blessing your children and grandchildren by loving the church. We've discussed blessing your children and grandchildren by loving your spouse. And then finally, we discussed blessing your children and grandchildren with your time. And so, my friends, no matter what area of life you're in, whether you're a great-grandparent or a grandparent or a parent or an aunt or an uncle or just someone who happens to know some kids, each of us has an example. They see our example. So, let's bless our children and grandchildren by being the best Christians we can be. Now, of course, that doesn't just benefit them. That benefits us. And it benefits the church at large. Let's bless those children by being the best Christians we can be. And then when they are older, they can bless us by being the best Christians they can be. Now today, as we're wrapping things up, if you have a need, maybe you realize that your example hasn't been the greatest, and you need help with that. Maybe you have some other need that's not connected with children that you need to let the congregation know about. In just a minute, we're going to have our invitation song, and I encourage you, come up to the front row, and one of our elders will speak with you. And if you are not yet a Christian, maybe you're watching online or something of that nature, and you realize that you need to start setting a better example by dedicating your life to Christ. Setting an example for your kids of humbling yourself and being baptized into Christ. The invitation's also for you. If you have a need, please let it be known as Patrick leads us in this invitation song.